All right, let's go to Dustin in Colorado first. Hi, Dustin. How are you today?
Hi, V. I'm doing pretty good. Good to hear
Awesome.
from you guys.
Yeah, thanks for calling in.
Of course. Always a big fan. I didn't actually see who was co-host and didn't expect to see Matt today. So
Surprise.
Sorry.
got excited. Yeah. No, you're all good.
So what are you calling about?
It was kind of difficult to see it on the call screen. It's kind of hard to explain. I know Matt's touched on this on the Atheist Experience a couple of times, but I'm wondering why make the distinction that you are not convinced that God exists? Why wouldn't you say that I don't believe God exists or I believe God doesn't? Well, no, because they are different things. Why not just say God does not exist, just as unicorns don't exist? If evidence changes that, sure, but why not live your life saying God doesn't exist?
That's a good question. I think for me, it's a matter of taking the agnostic part of my worldview into account. I don't necessarily believe we can know like capital T truths necessarily. And so to say anything is 100% true would not necessarily gel with my worldview. And when you're talking with theists specifically, they usually approach is God real or not real as an ultimate T truth. Capital T truth, rather. So for me, saying God is not real or I don't believe God is real is easier than saying God is not real, just because that puts the burden not on me but on the other person.
Yeah, it's first of all saying I am not convinced a God exists is true for every God proposition, whereas I am convinced that a God does not exist might only be true for specific gods. Essentially, I don't want to claim that I can falsify an unfalsifiable proposition. So it's just a matter of being sound with epistemology. The other aspect is what V just touched on. I don't want to unnecessarily adopt a burden of proof that I may not be able to meet. So in logic, if we're constructing a syllogism, it's about a single proposition or a single issue, not both sides of it. There's a reason why in a courtroom we don't determine that the defendant is innocent. We just determine whether or not we are convinced of their guilt or not convinced of their guilt. And not being convinced of someone's guilt is not the same thing as being convinced that somebody's innocent.
Right. Imagine a coin toss, right? You say heads or tails, and someone tosses the coin and holds their hand over it. Saying I believe that it's heads is different than I don't know which side it's on, right? So you can reserve judgment because there's no way to know at that point.
But it's not an agnostic middle ground between two.
Right.
What we have is somebody who's saying that coin came up heads, and I'm going to bet my life on it and preach to everybody that coin came up heads. And we're saying we're not convinced it's heads. Doesn't mean we're convinced that it's tails. We might be, and
exactly.
For good reason. So it's just about making sure we parse things out in a way where you're not making a mistake with regard to foundations and epistemology, and that you are accurately representing what the truth is or what you believe.
Okay, so I just want to make sure that if I have like a good null hypothesis, rather than like a null hypothesis being this doesn't exist, we want to say we're not convinced that this exists. We have to provide evidence that convinces the existence of or the non-existence of. The null hypothesis should be indifferent.
No.
Is that different?
So I'm fine with in a courtroom, the null hypothesis is that the defendant is innocent until proven guilty. And when we're talking about the existence of something, the null hypothesis needs to be that something does not exist until there's demonstration that it exists, or more accurately, that we cannot believe or argue that it does not exist or that it exists until there's a demonstration of it. So atheism is essentially the null hypothesis. And we are, in fact, living our life as if there is no God, because until the situation changes and we have evidence for God, then your question and your concern that these are kind of functionally identical is accurate. But making sure that we're kind of precise in how we phrase it is how we avoid, well, hopefully we were avoiding confusion, but I don't know that there's any way to avoid confusion at this point.
Yeah, this seems to be a point of confusion quite a lot.
That's okay. I've called it with a kind of complicated way of. I mean, living your life and then phrasing how you live your life is going to be different things. I can see the problem with, like, if I say I'm an atheist and I believe God doesn't exist, I'm adopting a burden of proof then to say I've demonstrated that God doesn't exist, and that would be the problem.
Right, exactly.
Right. And if you said I'm an atheist who's going to live my life as if God doesn't exist, that's just a statement of what your null hypothesis is, what your default position is. I need to be convinced that there is a God before I can adopt, changes to my life based on that belief.
Right. And if you're talking, especially with a theist, about this issue, if you come at it by saying, I believe God doesn't exist, or just God doesn't exist, you're going to waste a whole lot of time arguing that with them instead of what you could be arguing about just based on semantics.
Especially if nobody's defined what God you're talking about.
Right.
You'd be like, your God is fictional. Okay, prove it. Well, okay, tell me what your God is. And now you look, really silly that you have reached a conclusion before anything's even been defined.
Mm-hmm.
Oops. Well, I mean, this is a good conversation to have. I think I'd spoken with V and Eric last time I had called in. I have great interest in trying to actually create a show where I could have conversations like this with people. And I'm still very young and green to this, but I am passionate about it.
Me
I'm
too.
a biologist. I've studied evolution, and I feel like that's going to come up a whole bunch if I start a show.
Sure.
Yeah.
And it may be worthwhile for people who have expertise like yours to start doing content like that, because we're going to get countless calls about biology and evolution, and neither of us are scientists. Yeah, we probably understand these topics better than theistic creationists who are calling in, because we probably understand their Bible and their religion better than they do, because most people just don't really have a good understanding of what they believe and why.
Yeah. But yeah, if you start a channel talking about the biology bit and the evolution bit, we'll just forward them over to you.
I would appreciate that greatly. I'll let you know if I tried contacting Boulder, and it looks like that organization's kind of shut down, so I'll have to probably start from scratch entirely.
Well, if you just
find an open radio show.
I realize that moving away from Colorado would probably get you to someplace where weed isn't legal, but if you were to come to Austin, maybe Mark would put you to work.
I just started a job as a biologist. I think I'm going to be here for a little while, but I appreciate the offer.
Well, congratulations.
Okay. Yeah, for sure. Thanks for calling in.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you guys for taking my call. Have a great rest of your Sunday.
You too.
You too.